All right, my minions, welcome back to another episode of APUSH. We got chapter 17 today. We are going to talk about the post-Civil War era again, this time focusing more on that Industrial Revolution and what we're going to call the Second Industrial Revolution. We always want to sound super smart, and although we would never be marked wrong for referring to this Industrial Revolution as just the Industrial Revolution, we want to sound super smart in our writing and refer to the First or the Second Industrial Revolution. To remind you, the First Industrial Revolution was before the Civil War. This was that early time period, like the Lowell Girls, the factory system, Erie Canal era, American system, Henry Clay. That's your first industrial revolution, okay? And then we hadn't talked about it for a long time, and now the Industrial Revolution again really picks up after the Civil War. We're going to refer to this in American history as the Second Industrial Revolution. So, from the end of the Civil War to 1900, America goes from number 5 in the world in industrial output to number 1. So in a very short amount of time, America becomes very dominant, all right, and we become a world superpower as far as industrial capacity and industrial output. The economy of America is also going to change. For all of our history thus far, America's economy has been based off of agriculture. Well, that is not true any longer. Now, our economy is going to start to be based off of industry, okay, the factories and what they produce. So this is going to change. And we're going to see a couple of big businesses rise during this era. We're going to call this the Gilded Age, and we'll see later on what that term means. But during this time period, okay, lots of change, and we're going to see the rise of industry. We can't see the rise of industries and factories and industrial output without also seeing inventions and innovations that allow this all to happen. Now, communication, which is very important in business, a very big invention was the telephone, okay? Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone, that is huge for communication. This is going to replace the telegraph, which, if you remember, the telegraph was similar to the telephone, except you just didn't hear people's voices on the other end. You heard a series of beeps. That was called Morse code. As for another invention that's going to revolutionize factories and factory work is the light bulb. Okay, Thomas Edison and the light bulb. Now, for the obvious reasons, the light bulb was revolutionary, but specifically for factories, this is going to allow factories to work later, and that means workers are going to suffer the consequences. Okay, workers are going to have to work longer. Yeah, sure, they can produce more stuff, but that's not necessarily good for these conditions, for these workers who are being exhausted to death. So let's refer back to a term that we've kind of mentioned thus far, and something you probably are aware of. It's an economic idea involving that, or meaning that the government does not get involved in the economy or businesses, and that's called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire basically allows the government to say, you know what, we're just going to, allow businesses in the economy to do their thing. We're not going to get involved. This is going to allow for those big businesses, those captains of industry we're about to talk about, to rise. So, one of the guys that you may have learned about in science in years past, Charles Darwin, right? He was that scientist who observed birds on the Galapagos Island, and he, learns this idea that certain birds were able to adapt to their environment. They grew certain beaks and they survived. He called that survival of the fittest. Take that idea of survival of the fittest and apply it to society. Because the government is not regulating business, you're essentially going to see these businesses unregulated and allow their corporation owners to become so rich and powerful. Guys like Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller, etc. This idea that survival of the fittest, these rich guys were able to figure out how to become rich and powerful, we're going to call that social Darwinism. Okay, social Darwinism is the idea, just like Charles Darwin said in the Galapagos Islands, that the strongest survive and the weak die out. we're applying that to society, to economics, okay? The rich guys like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, etc., they figured it out, okay? And everyone else who is not them cannot figure it out. They're not as strong, and so they're going to die out. Speaking about Carnegie, Carnegie, for all the stuff we'll talk about him, he could be viewed as a good guy or a bad guy. And one of the things that Carnegie wants to make sure he does is spread his wealth and try to make sure he gives back. All right, and it's probably a good thing. We want to see, people who are wealthy give back to the community, give back to those who are less fortunate. He calls this his gospel of wealth. He believes that it's his gospel or his Christian duty to give back to those less fortunate, okay? And this is something that has popped up on the exam numerous times. So the gospel of wealth just means, hey, listen, I'm rich and powerful. I should probably give back to those less fortunate. Let's talk about two terms that are essential to this chapter, and there's two different ways in which guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie became very rich and powerful. The first is horizontal integration. This essentially means I'm going to become rich and powerful by buying out my competition in the same field in which my company is. So Rockefeller uses this idea. He buys up other competing oil companies and consolidates them into his company to make himself more rich and powerful. He will own the industry. We call this horizontal integration, just like a horizontal line, all different companies, the same type of company he buys out his competitors, okay? So if I were to open up a pizza shop in Brentwood, I'm going to use horizontal integration to become rich. I'm going to buy out my competitors, okay? All the pizza shops in the area, I'm going to buy them out. This way I have no competitors, and that's going to make me rich. Whereas vertical integration, okay, use Carnegie, he says, here's what I'm going to do to become rich. I'm going to control the entire process of production from steel making, okay, extracting the raw materials to selling the finished product. All right, controlling the entire process, having no middleman. Back to my pizza shop analogy, if I own the pizza shop, in order for me to become rich and powerful, I use vertical integration. What I'm going to do is, not only do I sell the pizza, but also I have a farm where I can produce the milk and the cheese, and I grow the plants, the tomatoes and the vegetables that are going to help me make my sauce, etc. Okay, I control the entire process from producing the raw materials to the finished product. Okay, and that's vertical integration. So these two different ideas, definitely know what they mean, know the differences between both of them, and know which one is used by Carnegie and Rockefeller. Okay, so the major guys in this chapter that are mentioned, okay, you have to know about them. The two major ones we already mentioned, Rockefeller and Carnegie. Rockefeller makes his money in oil, Carnegie makes his money in steel. Then you have Vanderbilt in the railroads, you have JP Morgan in banking, and then the other guy is Henry Ford in cars. Okay, so those are the major captains of industry or robber barons. Captains of industry kind of refers to these, guys as being, wow, I marvel them. They became rich and powerful. I envy how they did it. Their story from rags to riches, meaning they started with nothing. They started from the bottom. Now we're here. Bad joke, I know. Or robber baron means kind of has this negative connotation in the sense of, well, yeah, they're rich and powerful, but how'd they do it? They exploited their workers, okay? And that's not fair. That's not cool. Now, speaking about their workers, a lot of their workers that they took advantage of were, in fact, immigrants. Now, before I talk about the immigrants of this era, we need to also go back in time and talk about the old wave of immigrants that we mentioned weeks ago. This is a very popular short answer question. The exam does like you to know this as far as the difference between the old wave of immigrants and the new wave of immigrants. The old wave of immigrants came before the Civil War. They were from Northern and Western Europe. They were largely literate, okay, because most of them knew English if they're coming from England and Ireland, for example. Even some Germans, they even knew English. They had skilled professions, okay, skilled professions that were useful, and they were very quick to assimilate. They sometimes came from countries that supported democracy, again, Ireland and England, and they weren't completely poor. Very, very different from the new immigrants that come after the Civil War. We call this the new wave immigrants. During this time, the Gilded Age, or era that we're talking about right now, they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe and also Asia. They're usually different religions than Protestant. You see more Catholic, more Greek Orthodox, more Jewish, mostly illiterate because they don't know English, mostly unskilled professions, pretty poor, sometimes coming from countries that had radical ideas like socialism or communism. This is very different than the old wave of immigrants. Now, speaking about immigrants, we always ask the question, why are immigrants coming and what is, pushing them out of their country? So we call this the push and pull factors. What's pulling immigrants to our country? What's pushing them out of their country? Well, why do immigrants always come here? Usually for jobs, sometimes for religious persecution or freedom, I should say, economic, stability. They want the opportunities to earn money. They want political freedom. Maybe they're being persecuted for their ideas, their beliefs as far as politics go. And also the stories from previous generations, right? Everybody wants to be Andrew Carnegie, who, the rags to riches story that I mentioned before. Rags to riches just means, you start here with nothing and then all of a sudden you become rich and powerful like Andrew Carnegie. That's the pull factors. The push factors. What is pushing people out of their own countries? Well, sometimes the loss of land, okay? Europe is running out of land. There's not a lot left. So you will see a lot of people come over to America to get some land of their own. Maybe economic opportunity. Maybe there is political instability. Guys like Otto von Bismarck are pushing people out of their country. Religious persecution, all right? The things going on over in Russia and Eastern Europe, the pogroms, the persecution of the Jews. So there's many push and pull factors. A lot of these transcend time. They're not just specific to this Gilded Age for us, but these are the push and pull factors. Now, speaking about immigrants, how do Americans usually perceive immigrants and what do they think that they're taking from them? Usually Americans are upset with immigrants because they feel they're taking their jobs. And this prejudice towards immigrants is called nativism. Nativism is a term meaning, we've talked about this before, but it's a term meaning that native-born Americans believe that immigrants are taking their jobs from them, okay? And with Ellis Island open in 1892, we're starting to see a lot of immigrants come into the country from all different places of the world, and you're going to see a lot of native-born Americans be not okay with this. You're going to see the racial aspect of it, where they feel like they're superior to these immigrants. They're going to be upset because of them taking their jobs. They're coming with radical ideas from countries that don't have democracy. They're not Protestant. And so in response, you're going to start to see legislation, the government actually start to enact some laws that reflect this growing sense of nativism. And the sad thing is, I always ask this if we were in class, do we still have nativism around today? Are people still nativist? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. Okay? So during this time period, though, okay, that we're talking about in this chapter, we are going to see things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we'll talk about in a minute. The American Protective Association, you don't have to know it, but I just wanted to give you an example of an anti-Catholic group that's very upset that Catholic people are coming here. Because remember, the predominant religion of Americans is Protestant. You're going to see literacy tests. Literacy tests we usually don't talk about in the context of immigrants, but literacy tests, if you don't know what it is, in order to vote, you have to pass a test that shows you're literate. We'll talk more about this with African Americans later on in Chapter 18, but these were also preventing immigrants from voting as well. The Quota Acts in the 1920s, we'll get there in a few weeks, so you don't have to be concerned about that just yet. But let's start with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay, pretty self-explanatory. It's obviously targeting Chinese people. Geographically speaking, most Chinese people were moving out towards the western parts of our country to build the railroad and also to be the miners out in the West Coast. And Americans are, unfortunately pretty racist and pretty nativist about all this, and so they don't want any more Chinese people coming here. So the Chinese Exclusion Act is actually America's first piece of legislation that is targeting immigration. Okay? We haven't seen anything like this thus far, but it's also not the last time that we'll see this. Okay? So stay tuned. We'll talk more about immigrant legislation later. Okay, speaking about immigrants and workers, you are during this time period going to see more workers start to unionize. Okay, now, first of all, we've mentioned a union in the past. Okay, what is a union? A union is a group of workers that are banding together to protect the workers or fight for the workers. Some things that they want to protect and fight for are things like better pay, better hours, and better wages. Okay, so conditions, pay, and hours. Those are your what we call bread and butter issues, the basic needs or basic issues of a union, and the things that they want to protect and fight for. Problem is, unions aren't very union-like at this time. They're not very united. A union is supposed to be a group of workers that unite together to, fight and protect each other, but things like, race, ethnicity, religion, skilled and unskilled workers, those are things that are really dividing labor unions. They're also not getting a lot of help from the government because the big businesses are pretty much stomping over them. What are some things that these corporations, monopolies, big businesses are doing to them? Well, okay, if workers decide to go on a strike, now be mindful, okay, a strike is when workers decide they're not going to go to work because they're trying to prove a point, they're trying to fight for something. During this time period, the corporations, the business owners said, okay, you want to go on strike, I'm just going to hire someone else to replace you, and you just lost your job. So obviously scabs, that's what we're going to call them. Scabs are something used, a tactic used by business owners during that time period that they can get around strikes. Court injunctions, the court will get involved, but usually most of the time they're going to side with big business. Yellow dog contracts, this means when you go to sign your contract to take your new job, the business owner is going to say, hey, listen, sign this piece of paper. I'll give you your job. In return, you're going to sign off saying that you promise you will not join a union. And if you do, I can fire you. So that's a yellow dog contract. Can't do that today, by the way. Blacklisting. So, I don't know, someone went on strike who works for me, and to get them back, what I'm going to do is I'm going to blacklist them. I'm going to say, okay, first of all, you're fired, okay, because you went on strike. Second of all, I'm going to make sure you don't get a job anywhere else in the city. I'm going to tell everyone else how bad you are, and that's called blacklisting. The other thing is public opinion of unions during this time period was not good. Okay, people viewed them as being too radical, and so unions didn't have a good rep at the beginning. The very first big national union was the National Labor Union, 1866. This is their first attempt to organize workers. Not too successful. The first major successful one would be the Knights of Labor. This one you definitely have to know. This was created by Terence Powderly, and it included an array of workers, meaning it included skilled and unskilled workers, women, and African Americans. Problem was viewed as too radical, and what really killed them was the Haymarket Square riot in 1886, which we'll talk about in a second. after the Knights of Labor kind of dies out, the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor, which is created by Samuel Gompers, this one you also have to know, picks up the pieces of the Knights of Labor, and they become even more powerful and more successful. And they're going to focus on just skilled workers and the bread and butter issues. Like I said before, those are your basic issues. By 1900, this is the largest union in America. So those two unions, Knights of Labor and AFL, you have to know them, definitely know who created them, and know the differences, okay, of the type of workers that were involved in each. Now, we mentioned before that the public views unions as being too radical. So let's answer the question as to why that is. Here's a couple of examples of what unions are doing during this time period and how their protests or strikes are going down. First off, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes, we mentioned him a couple of weeks ago. He is the guy that becomes president that ends Reconstruction because of the Compromise of 1877. But he, as president, uses federal troops to put down the strike, which shows the government is taking the side of big business and not the workers. So that's not good for them. Next, the Haymarket Square. We mentioned this on the last slide. This is going to lead to the downfall of the Knights of Labor because this involves a bomb exploding in the public place in Haymarket Square over in Illinois. That's not good. And when a bomb goes off, this is really going to point fingers at the Knights of Labor as being kind of like a terrorist group, if you will, where they're all about anarchy and trying to prove a point the wrong way. And so that leads to their downfall because it's just too radical. Next, the Homestead Strike. This has to do with Andrew Carnegie's mill. While Andrew Carnegie is over in Europe, gallivanting with his money and having, tea time, he leaves his factory in charge of a guy named Henry Clay Frick. It's not the Henry Clay. Okay, Henry Clay is dead. Henry Clay Frick is a pretty mean dude. He's not really your ideal boss you want to work for. And what happens is the workers don't like the way they're being treated, and so they go on strike. Now, to defeat their strike, Henry Clay Frick locks them out. So he locks the doors. He tells them not allowed to go into the factory. He hires guards with guns to essentially guard the factory to make sure they don't get in. And then he hires scabs to replace them. Well, needless to say, things go very wrong. And the workers bust down the gates. The guards that were hired start shooting. People start dying. And this is a huge mess on the hands of Henry Clay Frick and really ultimately Andrew Carnegie. But there's more to that story later on. But ultimately, this also is going to make unions and Andrew Carnegie look pretty bad. So the Pullman strike is another one we'll talk about later on, so stay tuned. Okay, so we talked about strikes. We talked about, I've mentioned this past. Let's talk about the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. This briefly mentioned last chapter, towards the end. We've talked about laissez-faire. We've talked last chapter about the farmers were being taken advantage of the railroads. Remember, the first monopoly of America is the railroads. The courts get involved by with a case called Munn v. Illinois. This allowed the government to actually intervene and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to take control of the railroads and interstate commerce, which is trade between the states, in case you're not sure what interstate commerce means. The government in Munn v. Illinois, the courts say, instead of the government having control, let's give the power to the states. Now, think for a second. Think back to the Articles of Confederation. How did it work out in the Articles of Confederation when they had control of interstate commerce? It didn't work out very well. And so, this is not going to work out. The Munn v. Illinois case will be overturned by the Wabash case, not too long afterwards. And the Wabash case sets up the Interstate Commerce Act, which basically is now creating a federal agency that is in charge of interstate commerce. Again, trade between the states. This seems like a very big win for the farmers and for all of the small business owners. However, it actually was largely ineffective when it was first created. It will not be until Teddy Roosevelt's era as president where this will be used to break up the railroads and such. So even though the Interstate Commerce Commission is a really, really good thing, largely ineffective, and that's not good. Another thing that was created that also was largely ineffective was called the Sherman Antitrust Act. This said trusts and monopolies need to be regulated as far as their prices and their trading. Again, sounds like a really good thing. However, too much power was being given to these corporations, and the government was unwilling to really give this Sherman Antitrust Act power. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act, Interstate Commerce Commission, on paper sound really, really good, but ineffective. They will not really be used for their true purposes until the Progressive era, until our Teddy Roosevelt era. And that is it of this chapter, okay? So we kind of leave it off on a cliffhanger. We'll start to talk about next week a little bit more during this era, and then finally chapter 19 get into the Progressive era and how our presidents like Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson start to turn this Gilded Age around, okay? Hopefully you found this video to be useful for your studies. Again, as always, if you found this to be helpful, just give it a like or a subscribe. Other than that, have a wonderful day, ladies and gentlemen.